A Roman emperor's private journal and a modern therapist's treatment manual are built on the same hidden blueprint. This is the story of a 2,000-year-old accident where an ancient philosophy of resilience accidentally engineered the core model of today's most effective psychotherapy. By the end of this exploration, you will see the direct, step-by-step link between a Stoic's mental exercises and the clinical techniques that help millions. We will uncover how a system designed for virtue became a template for healing, and why a single insight about our judgments bridges the gap between Marcus Aurelius and your therapist's couch. What does it mean when a tool for ruling an empire also works for quieting a troubled mind? That hidden blueprint begins with a simple perspective. For centuries, philosophy was often seen as a grand debate about the nature of the universe, a search for ultimate truths. But in the bustling markets and port cities of the Hellenistic world, a new kind of thinking emerged, one less concerned with cosmic mysteries and far more focused on a single, pressing question. How do you live a good life? How do you find peace and purpose in a world that feels chaotic, unpredictable, and often painfully unfair? This was the fertile ground where Stoicism took root. It arrived not as an abstract theory, but as a practical toolkit. Imagine you are handed a manual, not for building a machine, but for building an unshakable character. That was the Stoic proposition. Its founders, like Zeno of Citium, taught in a painted colonnade or stoa in Athens, giving the school its name. But it was in Rome that this philosophy found its most powerful expression and its most famous practitioners. Think of Seneca, the playwright and advisor to an emperor, writing letters of profound psychological advice. Picture Epictetus, a former slave, teaching students that true freedom comes from within, regardless of one's external circumstances. And of course, Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the world, using his private journal not to record decrees, but to coach himself through doubt, anger, and exhaustion. For all of them, the target was eudaimonia. This ancient Greek word is often translated as happiness, but it means something deeper, like human flourishing or a life lived well. And Stoics had a very specific map to get there. They argued that flourishing could not be found in wealth, fame, power, or even perfect health. Those were external gifts, given and taken away by fortune's whim. True flourishing, they said, was the result of one thing only, virtue, to be wise, courageous, just, and disciplined. But here is the critical twist. You cannot simply decide to be virtuous in a moment of crisis. Virtue is not a switch you flip. It is the final product of a much more fundamental skill, the mastery of your own internal world. Your judgments, your desires, your reactions. The Stoics realized that before you can act with courage in the world, you must first learn to manage the storm of impressions inside your own mind. They were, in essence, early cognitive engineers. They were not trying to treat anxiety or depression as we define them today. Their goal was ethical excellence. Yet, in their meticulous process of training the mind to achieve that excellence, they accidentally built the scaffolding for a future science of mental health. They started by asking, what is the one thing we truly control? And their answer would become the first, crucial piece of that hidden blueprint. 2,000 years later, a quiet revolution in a therapist's office would echo that same Stoic question about control. In the middle of the 20th century, the dominant force in psychology was psychoanalysis. This approach looked deeply into the past, into childhood experiences and the unconscious mind, seeking the roots of present-day distress in long-buried memories and hidden conflicts. Therapy could be a lengthy process of exploration and interpretation, but a growing number of clinicians and researchers began to ask a different, more immediate question. What if we could help people not just by understanding why they feel bad, but by showing them how to feel better right now. This practical impulse gave birth to cognitive behavioral therapy, often called CBT. It would quickly become the gold standard, the most rigorously tested and effective psychological treatment we have for common challenges like persistent anxiety and low mood. Its power lies in a deceptively simple premise, one that sounds almost philosophical. CBT proposes that our emotions and behaviors are not directly caused by events themselves. They are caused by our interpretations of those events, the thoughts that flash through our minds in the split second after something happens. Think of it this way. You are walking down the street and you see a friend from a distance. You wave, but they walk right past without seeming to notice. One person might think, they must be angry with me. I must have done something wrong. That thought likely leads to feelings of sadness, worry, and a behavior like withdrawing or ruminating. Another person might think, they seem really focused. They probably just didn't see me. That thought leads to a neutral or mildly concerned emotion, and a behavior like sending a friendly text later to check in. The event was identical. The emotional and behavioral outcomes were completely different, shaped entirely by the cognition, the automatic thought in between. CBT is built on mapping and changing those thoughts. It is structured, collaborative, and focused on the present. A therapist working with CBT is less an archaeologist of the past and more a coach for the present, helping clients identify these automatic thought patterns, examine the evidence for and against them, and develop more balanced, realistic ways of seeing their situation. It is a skill-based therapy, often involving exercises and practices to try between sessions. This evidence-based, practical approach represented a monumental shift. But for all its modern clinical rigor, its core model, that fundamental triangle connecting events, thoughts, and feelings, was waiting in plain sight, inscribed in the pages of those ancient journals. The Stoics were not treating clinical disorders, but they were master cartographers of that very same mental terrain. This shared insight is the master key to both systems. It is the profound recognition that our emotional world is not a direct pipeline from the outside in. Something crucial happens in the gap between an event and our feeling about it. The Stoics called this intermediary a judgment or a belief. Epictetus, the former slave-turned-teacher, framed it with unforgettable clarity. He wrote, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them." In a later translation, the phrase became even more famous. It is not things that upset us, but our judgments about things. Picture a simple scenario from the ancient world. A Roman merchant receives news that a storm has sunk one of his cargo ships. The event is the loss of the ship. The Stoic would say the merchant's despair, anger, or fear does not flow directly from the sunken wood. It flows from the judgments he attaches to that event. A judgment like, "My entire livelihood is ruined," or "This proves I am cursed by the gods," or "I will never recover from this." The event is neutral in a sense. The judgment gives it its emotional power. Now, fast forward 2 millennia to the office of a modern cognitive behavioral therapist. A client describes feeling a crushing wave of anxiety after their manager sends a brief, ambiguous email. The therapist helps map the sequence. The activating event is the email. The emotional consequence is intense anxiety, but the therapy focuses on what lies in between, the automatic belief. The client's mind might have instantly produced a thought like, "I made a huge mistake," or "They are going to fire me," or "I am not good enough at this job." In CBT, this is the B in the ABC model, activating event, belief, consequence. The model is a clinical diagram of Epictetus's dictum. The belief is the modern term for the ancient judgment. Both philosophies, separated by culture, language, and 2,000 years, identified the same critical leverage point in the human experience. They realized we suffer less from what happens to us, and more from the story we tell ourselves about what happens. This is not about denying pain or pretending hardship does not exist. It is about understanding the mechanics of that pain. The storm did sink the ship. That is a real external hardship. The manager did send the email, but the depth of the emotional turmoil that follows is dictated by the architecture of our internal narrative. The Stoic and the cognitive behavioral therapist meet right here at this crossroads of perception. They both assert that if you want to change how you feel, you must first learn to see, and then to question, the invisible interpretations you are building in that fleeting moment between event and reaction. This is where theory becomes practice, and where an ancient quest for virtue begins to look remarkably like a modern protocol for resilience. That shared insight about judgments was just the starting point. Stoicism did not stop at diagnosing the problem. It built a full workshop for solving it. The ancient philosophers moved beyond brilliant observation into the realm of systematic practice. They developed a repeatable method, a set of mental exercises designed to intervene precisely at that critical moment between an event and your emotional reaction. They were crafting what we would now call a protocol. This was not casual advice. It was a disciplined regimen for the mind. Marcus Aurelius would rise before dawn and rehearse the challenges the day might bring, not to worry, but to prepare his judgments in advance. Seneca advised nightly reviews, dissecting the day's events to see where his reactions had been wise or foolish. Epictetus drilled his students with relentless questioning, teaching them to separate what was within their control from what was not. Each of these practices served a single, overarching purpose: to create a gap, a moment of pause between the initial impression and the final judgment. In that gap lies the possibility of choice. This is where philosophy transforms from a theory into a technology of the self. The Stoics were not merely saying our judgments shape our reality. They were providing the tools to reshape those judgments themselves. They built a staircase from principle to practice, one deliberate step at a time. And in doing so, they accidentally engineered the core structure of a therapeutic process. The following sections will unpack this ancient protocol piece by piece. We will see how their exercises for examining impressions map directly onto cognitive restructuring, how their focus on what is within our control establishes the foundation for behavioral activation, and how their concept of virtue provides a surprising analog for building a life of value and meaning. This is the accidental blueprint, a 2,000-year-old system for mental training waiting to be rediscovered by a world in need of resilience. The first step in their ancient protocol was a skill of vigilant awareness. The Stoics called it prosoche, a term meaning attention or mindfulness. This was not a passive state of relaxation, but an active, disciplined guard duty over one's own mind. Its purpose was singular: to catch the very first spark of a judgment before it could ignite into a full-blown emotional fire. Imagine your mind as a busy city gate. Countless impressions, like messengers, arrive constantly from the outside world. Prosoche is the gatekeeper, trained not to let every messenger rush straight to the ruler, your emotional core, with its alarming news. Instead, the gatekeeper stops the messenger and says, "Wait, let me examine your message." This is the critical pause. A Roman practicing prosoche would strive to notice the immediate, visceral impression that arose from an event. The flush of anger at an insult, the pang of fear at bad news, the surge of desire for a luxury. Their training was to intercept that raw impression and hold it in the light of reason before endorsing it as truth. Epictetus put it plainly, saying the first job of anyone who wishes to be good is to withdraw from the automatic assent we give to our impressions. Do not let them carry you away. This is the ancient art of thought-catching. Now step into a modern therapy room. A client learning cognitive behavioral therapy is taught an almost identical foundational skill. It is called monitoring automatic thoughts, or sometimes catching your automatic negative thoughts. Those are NTS. the therapist explains that we all have a stream of these rapid, evaluative thoughts that pop into our heads throughout the day. They are often distorted, exaggerated, or simply untrue, but we tend to accept them uncritically as immediate facts. The very first homework assignment is usually to simply notice them. To carry a small notebook or use a phone app, and whenever a strong emotion hits, to pause and ask, what was just going through my mind? What did I tell myself about this situation? This is not about solving the thought yet. It is about developing prosoche, that same gatekeeping awareness. The client catching the thought, I am going to fail this presentation and everyone will think I am a fraud, is performing the same cognitive operation as the Stoic catching the judgment. This difficulty proves I am inadequate. Both are interrupting an automatic process. Both are creating that essential gap between stimulus and reaction. For the Stoic, this attention was the bedrock of virtue, because you cannot choose a wise response if you are not even aware you are having a foolish reaction. For the CBT client, this self-monitoring is the bedrock of change, because you cannot challenge or change a thought pattern you do not know exists. This parallel is not a vague similarity. It is a point-for-point match in methodology. The ancient discipline of attention and the modern therapeutic skill of thought-catching are the same initial move in a much longer game of mental mastery. They train us to become observers of our own inner narrative, to see the machinery of our minds at work. And once you can see the machinery, you can begin to adjust it. Once you have caught that fleeting impression, the next step is to hold it up for examination. The Stoics developed a precise mental tool for this, a kind of philosophical scalpel. Modern scholars sometimes call it the Stoic fork. It is the practice of cleaving a single, tangled experience into two distinct parts. On one side, you place the bare, objective fact of what happened. On the other, you isolate the subjective value judgment your mind instantly glued onto it. This is the act of assaying an impression, testing it for purity like a goldsmith tests a metal. Consider a simple social slight, as common in ancient Rome as it is today. The event is this: you see an acquaintance across the forum, and they walk past without a word. The raw, unadorned fact is, he did not greet me. That is all you can say with absolute certainty. It is a neutral piece of data, but the human mind is not a passive recorder. It is an active interpreter. In a flash, it adds a layer of meaning, a judgment that transforms the data into a story. The story might be, he disrespects me, or I have offended him, or I am not worthy of his notice. The Stoic fork forces you to separate these two components. The fact is external and unchanging. The judgment, however, is your own contribution, an optional layer of evaluation you have the power to question. Epictetus trained his students to do this relentlessly. He would say, when you are distressed about an external event, it is not the thing itself that troubles you, but your judgment about it. And that judgment you have the power to erase at any moment. This is not about cold detachment. It is about intellectual clarity. By dissecting the impression, you reclaim agency. You move from being a prisoner of your automatic narratives to becoming their editor. Now, listen to the language in a contemporary therapist's office. A client shares a painful thought: my partner is late. This means they do not care about my feelings. The therapist might gently intervene with a question. Can we separate the observation from the interpretation? What is the observable fact here? The client might say, they are 15 minutes past the time we agreed. And what is the interpretation your mind added? That their lateness is a sign of disregard. This therapeutic technique is called cognitive distancing, or sometimes decentering. It teaches a person to see their thoughts as just that, thoughts, mental events that pass through the mind, not infallible statements of fact. The therapist might say, I notice you are having the thought that they do not care. This simple linguistic shift, I am having the thought that, instead of this is true, creates psychological space. it is the modern implementation of the Stoic fork. Both practices achieve the same profound shift in perspective. They break the hypnotic identification with our internal commentary. The ancient philosopher and the modern therapist are both guiding you to a vantage point where you can look at your own thinking, rather than being swept away by it. You are no longer fused with the belief he disrespects me. You can observe it, hold it, and ask the most liberating question of all: is this judgment true? Or is it merely one possible story among many? This question is the gateway to the next, most active phase of the process, where assessment turns into action. The true power of both systems emerges in this next decisive phase. Once you have caught the judgment and held it at a distance, you must now put it on trial. The Stoics did not advocate for blind acceptance of every passing thought. Instead, they turned to their most trusted tool, reason itself. They subjected their automatic judgments to a rigorous cross-examination, a process of logical interrogation that would feel remarkably familiar in any modern therapist's office. The Stoic philosopher was, in essence, their own defense attorney, prosecutor, and judge all at once. They would take a distressing belief like, "This public humiliation ruins my reputation," and systematically dismantle it with questions. Is this belief absolutely true, or merely a plausible story? What is the concrete evidence for it? What is the evidence against it? Is this situation truly within my sphere of control, or am I exhausting myself over an outcome dictated by others or by fortune? And perhaps most importantly, even if there is some truth to it, is holding this belief helpful? Does it move me toward virtue and peace, or does it only feed anger and despair? This was not positive thinking, it was reality testing. Marcus Aurelius constantly engaged in this internal dialogue. Faced with the irritating behavior of others, he would remind himself, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He was using logic to shrink a catastrophic judgment down to its true, manageable size. This practice of Socratic self-questioning was the Stoic method for achieving what they called apatheia, not a cold lack of feeling, but a state of clarity where the mind is not overthrown by destructive passions. Now translate this ancient courtroom of the mind to a contemporary cognitive behavioral therapy session. This core process has a specific name: cognitive restructuring. It is the collaborative, structured work of examining and changing unhelpful thought patterns. A therapist guides a client through a series of questions that are almost identical to the Stoic interrogation. Let us say a client's automatic thought is, "I completely failed that work presentation." The therapist would not simply offer reassurance. Instead, they would help the client investigate the thought. What is the evidence that you completely failed? Did you share all the information? Did anyone ask questions? Then, what is the evidence against a complete failure? Perhaps several colleagues thanked you for the clarity, or you managed to answer a tough question. The therapist might ask, even if parts could have been better, does that equal total failure? What is a more balanced way to describe the outcome? Finally, they would explore the impact. How does believing you completely failed make you feel and act? Does that belief help you improve, or does it just make you want to avoid future presentations? This step-by-step examination is not about swapping a negative thought for a blindly positive one. It is about arriving at a thought that is more accurate, more nuanced, and ultimately more useful. The Stoic seeking a judgment aligned with virtue, and the CBT client seeking a belief aligned with reality, are engaged in the same fundamental act, using the light of reason to dispel the distortions of fear, habit, and bias. They are both learning that our initial interpretations are often hypotheses, not verdicts, and that we have the right and the ability to appeal. The courtroom of reason leads to a final, liberating verdict. After dissecting our judgments, we face a fundamental question. Where do we invest our limited energy? The Stoics provided a razor-sharp answer: a principle so central it became the defining filter for their entire philosophy. This is the dichotomy of control, and it is the ultimate cognitive tool for mental peace. The teacher Epictetus framed it with unforgettable clarity at the very opening of his handbook. "Some things are up to us," he wrote, "and some things are not up to us. Our own judgments, our impulses, our desires, our actions, these are within our power. Everything else, our bodies, our possessions, our reputations, the actions of other people, even the outcomes of our best efforts, these are not fully within our power. They belong to the realm of externals." This was not a casual observation. It was a preemptive cognitive filter, a sorting mechanism for every single impression that entered the mind. Imagine your daily experience as a constant stream of incoming data. The dichotomy of control is the algorithm that instantly categorizes each piece. Is this thing up to me? If yes, it is worthy of your full attention, your effort, and your care. If no, it is to be accepted with a kind of calm detachment, because to struggle against it is to struggle against the nature of the world itself. It is like trying to command the tide. This practice was the Stoics' master strategy for dissolving anxiety and helplessness before they could even form. A student worried about an upcoming speech might be tormented by thoughts of the audience's reaction. Epictetus would guide them through the filter. Is the audience's opinion up to you? No, it is an external. Is preparing your speech well, practicing your delivery, and speaking with clarity up to you? Yes, that is entirely within your power. Therefore, invest all your effort there and release the white-knuckle grip on the outcome. This shifts the entire locus of your struggle from an uncontrollable future to a manageable present task. Now, listen to the language of a modern cognitive behavioral therapist working with a client paralyzed by social anxiety. The client's distress often revolves around terrifying external outcomes. What if they think I am boring? What if I blush and everyone notices? The therapist does not offer a Stoic quote, but they guide the client through an almost identical filtering process. We call this focusing on the controllables. Can you control what other people think? No, that is their private mental process. Can you control whether you blush? Not directly, as it is an automatic physiological response. But what can you control? You can control preparing a few conversation topics. You can control practicing slow, deep breathing before the event. You can control choosing to attend and focusing on listening to others rather than monitoring yourself. The therapeutic intervention is a direct application of the dichotomy. It systematically redirects attention and effort away from the unchangeable circumstances that fuel anxiety and toward the modifiable thoughts and behaviors that build confidence. This is not about giving up, it is about strategic focus. Both systems recognize that a vast amount of human suffering comes from a single cognitive error, expending our emotional and mental resources trying to control the uncontrollable. The weather, the past, another person's feelings, the stock market. This futile effort creates a chronic state of helplessness and anxiety. The dichotomy of control and its therapeutic cousin focusing on controllables breaks that cycle. It teaches us to identify the small circle of our genuine agency and to pour our life into that space. By doing so, we reclaim a profound sense of personal power, not over the world but over our own response to it. We move from being victims of circumstance to authors of our own effort, and from that foundation of focused action, a surprising form of resilience begins to grow, one that the ancients called virtue and that modern therapy might call valued living. But this focus on control leads to a powerful paradox. The Stoics, masters of managing their judgments, deliberately invited the worst-case scenario into their minds. They practiced an exercise that seems, at first glance, like the opposite of tranquility. It was called Premeditatio Malorum, the premeditation of evils. This was not morbid pessimism or anxious worrying. It was a systematic form of mental vaccination. Each day, a practicing Stoic would set aside time to vividly imagine the potential hardships the day could bring. The loss of a possession, a professional setback, a personal insult, even the illness or passing of a loved one. They would not just list these possibilities. They would visualize them in detail, feeling the initial sting of the emotion, and then, crucially, they would rehearse their reasoned, virtuous response. Seneca wrote of doing this regularly, saying that we should send ourselves into exile, confront poverty, and meditate on illness, not because they will happen, but so that nothing takes us by surprise. The goal was to disarm fortune, by mentally experiencing a potential loss in advance with the safety of reason as a guide. They stripped the event of its power to shock and paralyze. The catastrophic blow became a manageable challenge, one they had already practiced navigating. This transformed fear into preparedness. Now, consider a modern therapeutic office where a client is struggling with debilitating panic about an upcoming flight. The therapist would not advise them to simply avoid thinking about it. Instead, they might guide the client through a technique called coping imagery, a core component of stress inoculation training. The client is asked to close their eyes and vividly imagine each step of the feared scenario, from packing their bag to feeling the plane accelerate down the runway. But as the anxiety rises, the therapist guides them to also imagine themselves using their coping skills, taking slow, deep breaths, repeating a calming phrase, or focusing on a grounding object. They mentally rehearse not the catastrophe, but their own competent response to the discomfort. This therapeutic practice is not about creating fear. It is about building a cognitive and emotional blueprint for resilience. It inoculates the mind against the shock of the real event by making the territory familiar. The ancient Stoic imagining the loss of status and the modern client imagining a panic attack are engaged in the same profound psychological maneuver. They are using the theater of the mind as a training ground. By voluntarily confronting feared possibilities in a controlled, safe mental space, they reduce the element of surprise and build confidence in their own capacity to cope. Both practices recognize a deep truth about anxiety. It often thrives on the unknown, on the vague, terrifying shadow of what might be. Premeditatio malorum and stress inoculation training shine a deliberate, rational light into that shadow, not to banish it, but to see it clearly, to map its contours, and to practice walking through it. This turns a potential ambush into a path you have already traveled in your mind. The emotional charge dissipates, replaced by a sense of agency. You are no longer a passive victim of a frightening future. You have already been there, and you know the way through. This mental training for adversity reveals the ultimate purpose of the Stoic system. After examining a judgment and accepting what they could not control, they did not stop at mere acceptance. They actively sought to transform the obstacle itself. This is where their philosophy moves from resilience to something like alchemy. The Stoics possessed a powerful reframing tool, one that turned every hardship into a potential training ground. They would look at a difficult situation, a personal insult, a financial loss, a professional setback, and ask a single, transformative question. What virtue does this circumstance allow me to practice? Is this an opportunity for patience, for courage, for justice, or for self-discipline? Marcus Aurelius captured this perfectly in his Meditations. He wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." A frustrating delay was not just an inconvenience, it was a drill for cultivating patience. A frightening risk was not just a threat, it was a gymnasium for building courage. An unfair criticism became a chance to practice the virtue of justice by responding with fairness even when it was not shown to you. This reframing was cognitive, but its goal was deeply ethical. It was about building character brick by brick, using the very rough materials life provided. The external event remained unchanged, but its internal meaning was completely rewritten. It was no longer a random piece of bad luck, but a deliberate, personalized curriculum for moral growth. The universe, in a sense, had become your personal trainer. Now, listen to the dialogue in a modern therapy session focused on cognitive reframing. A client describes feeling devastated after being passed over for a promotion. The initial automatic thought is, "I am not good enough, and my career here is over." A therapist using CBT would guide the client to explore alternative, more adaptive perspectives. This is not about toxic positivity or denying disappointment. It is about finding a viewpoint that is both realistic and empowering. The therapist might ask, while this is disappointing, what is another way to look at this situation? Could it provide clarity about what skills you want to develop? Does it free you to explore other opportunities you had not considered? Can this experience build your resilience for future challenges? The therapeutic reframe often focuses on agency, learning, and growth. It shifts the narrative from one of permanent defeat, "I am a failure," to one of temporary setback with potential for movement. This is a difficult moment that can inform my next steps. The client is learning to cognitively restructure the event's meaning, much like the Stoic restructured its purpose. Both processes involve a deliberate, conscious choice to see the same set of facts through a different, more constructive lens. The Stoic lens was virtue. The therapeutic lens is often psychological flexibility and valued action, but the mechanism is strikingly similar. They both reject the first, most distressing story the mind offers. They both engage in a search for a narrative that reduces suffering and increases a sense of capability. For the Stoic, the capable self was the virtuous self. For the client in therapy, the capable self might be the resilient self, the learning self, the self that can navigate difficulty without becoming defined by it. This is where an ancient quest for moral excellence seamlessly overlaps with a modern pursuit of mental health. Both are journeys toward a stronger, more adaptable version of oneself, using the friction of life not as something to merely endure, but as the essential grit that shapes a wiser mind. This profound overlap in methods raises an inevitable question. If the techniques are so similar, why wasn't Stoicism simply the ancient world's version of cognitive behavioral therapy? The answer lies in a fundamental difference of purpose and context, a missing laboratory. Stoicism was not a treatment. It was a comprehensive philosophy of life, a roadmap for human flourishing intended for anyone seeking to live well, regardless of their emotional state. Its primary aim was virtue, the cultivation of wisdom, courage, justice, and self-discipline as the highest good. The Stoics were cartographers of the human condition, mapping the entire terrain of the mind to guide people toward ethical excellence. Their exercises were for training, not for curing. They operated in the vibrant, messy arena of daily life, in lecture halls, private studies, and the imperial court, not in a clinical setting designed to address specific psychological distress. They lacked what defines modern therapy, the scientific method. There were no controlled clinical trials, no diagnostic manuals, no evidence-based protocols tailored for conditions like generalized anxiety or major depressive disorder. The Stoic sage might use the same cognitive tool as a modern therapist, but they were using it to build a cathedral of character, not to repair a specific crack in the foundation. This distinction is crucial. It explains the accidental nature of this 2,000-year-old parallel. The Stoics, in their relentless pursuit of understanding how to live a good life, stumbled upon fundamental principles of how the human mind works. They discovered that our judgments shape our reality, that focusing on what we control brings peace, and that rehearsing challenges builds resilience. They were brilliant psychologists, but they were not clinicians. Their system was universal and prescriptive, meant for the already well and the seeking, not a targeted intervention for those experiencing significant mental health challenges. Think of it as the difference between general fitness and physical therapy. a personal trainer gives everyone exercises to build overall strength and health. A physical therapist designs a specific, medically informed regimen to rehabilitate a particular injury. The Stoic was the personal trainer for the soul, offering a regimen for everyone. Cognitive behavioral therapy is the evidence-based rehabilitation protocol, developed through rigorous research to address identified patterns of suffering. This does not diminish the Stoic insight, it makes it more remarkable. Their map was so accurate that when science finally turned its full attention to the landscape of mental processes, it found the ancient coordinates were still valid. The therapeutic model did not copy the philosophy. It independently verified its core psychological mechanics through experimentation and data. This is why the connection feels so powerful, not because one was the blueprint for the other, but because both were looking at the same unchanging reality of the human mind, one through the lens of ethics, the other through the lens of clinical science. The philosophy provided the profound questions about how we think and feel. The therapy provided the scientifically tested methods for applying those answers to alleviate suffering. One was a way of life, the other became a tool for healing. And in that space between them, we find a timeless truth about our own capacity for change. The ancient Stoic workshop for the mind was not lost to history, but its tools lay scattered, waiting for a new kind of craftsman to reassemble them. For centuries, their psychological insights simmered in the background of Western thought, influencing philosophers who wrestled with the relationship between emotion and reason. In the 17th century, a thinker like Baruch Spinoza echoed the Stoic ideal of understanding our passions to achieve a state of tranquil wisdom. Yet these ideas remained largely in the realm of philosophy, admired but not yet clinically tested. The bridge from the painted colonnade to the therapist's office would be built by a man who was famously blunt, fiercely pragmatic, and who gave full, explicit credit to the source of his inspiration. His name was Albert Ellis. In the 1950s, Ellis, a trained psychoanalyst, grew deeply frustrated with the slow, often indirect methods of his field. He believed there had to be a more efficient way to help people change. His search led him back, directly and deliberately, to the Stoics. He would later write that the core philosophy of his new system was not original, stating that it originated with the ancient Stoic philosophers. Ellis had rediscovered Epictetus's dictum that we are disturbed not by events but by our views of them, and he recognized it not as a spiritual maxim, but as a practical hypothesis for psychological treatment. He built upon it to create rational emotive behavior therapy, or REBT. Ellis's approach was characteristically direct. He argued that psychological distress was largely the product of irrational beliefs, rigid demands we place on ourselves, others, and the world. Thoughts like, "I must be perfectly competent at all times," or "other people must treat me fairly," or "life should be easy." He saw that when these unrealistic demands collided with reality, the result was emotional turmoil. His therapeutic method involved vigorously and logically disputing these irrational beliefs, guiding clients to adopt more flexible, realistic preferences instead. The echo of Stoic interrogation is unmistakable. Ellis was in effect a clinical Epictetus, using Socratic questioning not to cultivate virtue, but to alleviate anxiety and depression. He took the ancient cognitive model and systematized it into a therapeutic protocol. This work did not happen in a vacuum. It created a seismic shift in the field. One of the young psychologists influenced by Ellis's revolutionary ideas was Beck. Initially a psychoanalyst himself, Beck was conducting research on depression when he made a pivotal observation. He noticed that his depressed patients experienced a constant stream of spontaneous, negative thoughts about themselves, their world, and their future. Beck called these automatic thoughts. He realized these thoughts were not just symptoms of depression, they were the very engine driving it. Building on the foundation Ellis had laid, Beck developed a more structured, collaborative, and research-driven approach. He focused on helping patients identify, test, and reformulate these automatic thoughts and the deeper belief systems underlying them. He called this approach cognitive therapy, which later evolved into the broader umbrella of cognitive behavioral therapy. So the historical thread is clear and direct. The Stoics provided the original, brilliant insight into the power of our judgments. Ellis picked up that thread, explicitly wove it into the fabric of a new therapeutic system, and handed it off. Beck then refined that system through rigorous scientific research, creating the evidence-based, widely practiced CBT we know today. It was not a vague parallel, but a genuine lineage. The philosophy of the mind had finally found its laboratory, and in the process, an ancient toolkit for building character was validated as a modern protocol for healing. Ellis carried the frustration of his patients like a physical weight. He watched them spend years in psychoanalysis, digging into their past, yet often remaining trapped in the same painful patterns in the present. He became convinced there had to be a more direct route to change, a way to help people not by endlessly analyzing the origin of their distress, but by altering the machinery of it in the here and now. His search for an answer led him not to a new scientific journal, but to an ancient text. He found his guiding star in a single, potent line from the handbook of Epictetus. People are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them. For Ellis, this was not a philosophical abstraction. It was a clinical hypothesis, a working model of human suffering that was stunningly simple and profoundly practical. He realized that if emotional turmoil was truly caused by our beliefs about events, then the most effective therapy would be to identify and change those beliefs. From this core Stoic insight, Ellis constructed the entire framework of rational emotive behavior therapy. He translated the ancient concept into a modern, structured formula he called the ABC model. The A stands for the activating event. This is the objective situation, the thing that happens, a job interview, a critical comment, a traffic jam. The C is the emotional and behavioral consequence. Feeling intense anxiety, lashing out in anger, or sinking into despair, traditional thinking might assume a directly causes C. The traffic jam makes you angry. But Ellis, following Epictetus, inserted the critical missing letter, B, for belief. It is not the traffic jam that causes the rage. It is the belief you hold about the traffic jam in that moment. Beliefs like, this is unbearable, or this always happens to me, or now my entire day is ruined. The traffic jam is neutral. The belief is what charges it with emotional power. This ABC model was not merely similar to the Stoic insight. It was a direct, conscious translation of it into a therapeutic tool. Ellis took the philosophical observation and gave it a clinical anatomy, creating a map that both therapist and client could use to navigate any moment of distress. He would teach clients to catch themselves at point C, the feeling of anxiety, and then work backwards. What was the A, and most importantly, what was the B? What are you telling yourself right now about this event? This process made the invisible visible. It turned a vague feeling of overwhelm into a specific, examinable thought. Ellis' genius was in recognizing that these beliefs were often irrational, rigid demands we place on reality. He called them musts. I must succeed perfectly. Others must treat me fairly. The world must be easy. When these inflexible demands collide with the messy, unpredictable nature of life, the result is what he called catastrophic thinking, and the emotional consequences are severe. His therapeutic method then became D for disputing those irrational beliefs. He would challenge them with logic and evidence, helping clients replace their rigid musts with flexible preferences. I would prefer to succeed, but it is not a catastrophe if I do not. I would like others to be fair, but I cannot control their actions. This disputation was the modern, therapeutic enactment of the Stoic practice of examining impressions with reason. Ellis did not hide his source. He openly and repeatedly credited the Stoics, especially Epictetus, as the foundational inspiration for his entire approach. This creates a concrete, documented historical link, a verifiable intellectual lineage. It is not that modern therapy accidentally stumbled upon principles the Stoics also knew. It is that one of the founders of modern cognitive therapy deliberately reached back 2,000 years, found a psychological truth waiting for him, and built a clinical practice upon it. The bridge from the Stoa to the consulting room was not built by chance. It was built by a man who read an ancient quote and saw, with stunning clarity, the blueprint for a revolution in healing. Aaron Beck began his work with a very different focus. As a psychiatrist and researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, he was initially committed to the psychoanalytic model, expecting to find that depression was rooted in unconscious anger turned inward. But something didn't fit. As he listened carefully to his patients, he noticed a pattern that the old theories couldn't explain. They weren't just feeling sad. Their minds were generating a relentless, silent commentary, a stream of instantaneous negative judgments about themselves, their experiences, and their future. Beck called these automatic thoughts. They were brief, specific, and so habitual that the patients often didn't even notice them as separate from reality itself. A person might think, "I am worthless," after making a minor mistake, or "this will never work out" when facing a routine challenge. Beck realized these thoughts were not mere symptoms of depression. They were the fuel for it. Each automatic negative thought acted like a drop of dye, coloring the person's entire perception of the world. This was a monumental clinical insight. He had independently arrived at the same core territory the Stoics had mapped. Where Epictetus saw disturbing judgments, Beck saw automatic negative thoughts. Both identified the same critical intermediary between event and emotion, but Beck did something the Stoics never could. He turned this observation into a structured, testable, scientific treatment. He developed a systematic method to help patients first catch these fleeting thoughts, then to treat them not as facts but as hypotheses to be investigated. He would ask, what is the evidence for that thought? What is the evidence against it? Is there an alternative, more balanced way of seeing this? This collaborative, Socratic questioning became the heart of cognitive therapy. Beck was providing the clinical manual for the Stoics' philosophical insight. He wasn't teaching virtue, but he was teaching a skill, the skill of cognitive restructuring. His patients learned to become scientists of their own minds, gathering data on their thoughts and testing their validity. Through rigorous clinical trials, Beck and his colleagues demonstrated that this approach was remarkably effective at alleviating the symptoms of depression and anxiety. This was the scientific validation. The ancient hypothesis that our judgments shape our reality was now supported by empirical data. Beck's model crystallized all these threads, from Ellis's rational framework to his own clinical observations, into a coherent, teachable system, cognitive behavioral therapy. In doing so, he completed the bridge. He took the profound psychological truth discovered by the philosophers and built a reliable, evidence-based pathway across it, one that could be used not just for building character, but for healing profound distress. The mechanism was no longer just a wise observation. It was a clinical tool with step-by-step instructions. This transformation raises a fascinating question. If the core mechanism is so similar, what separates the ancient practice from the modern therapy? The difference lies not in the map of the mind, but in the purpose of the journey and the tools for navigation. A single piece of criticism lands in two different minds. Let us place the same hypothetical scenario side by side. You have just presented a project proposal at work. A senior colleague, in front of the entire team, says, "The financial projections here seem completely unrealistic. This whole approach is naive." The comment stings publicly. The event is identical. Now watch the two paths diverge and then, remarkably, converge. First, the practicing Stoic. The initial sting is the impression, the raw feeling of heat in the face, the tightening in the chest. This is where prosoche, that disciplined attention, activates. She notices the surge of emotion but does not immediately grab onto it. She creates a mental pause. In that space, she applies the Stoic fork. The bare fact is, my colleague stated that my projections seem unrealistic and called the approach naive. That is the observable data. The judgment she feels tugging at her is, he thinks I am incompetent, and he is right, I have embarrassed myself. She separates the fact from the story. Now she puts that judgment on trial. Is it absolutely true that I am incompetent? What is the evidence? I have prepared thoroughly. I have successful projects in the past, and another colleague nodded in agreement with my earlier point. Is his opinion within my control? No, it is an external. My own preparation, my response, and my continued effort are within my control. She applies the dichotomy, releasing her grip on his approval. Finally, she seeks the reframe. What virtue can I practice here? This is an opportunity for courage, to face criticism without crumbling, for wisdom, to discern any useful kernel in his feedback from the unhelpful delivery. Her constructive action becomes to review the projections calmly later, to seek clarification from him privately if needed, and to continue advancing the project with disciplined focus. The insult is metabolized into fuel for character. Now the client in a cognitive behavioral therapy session discussing the same event. The therapist guides them through the ABC model. The activating event A is the colleague's critical comment. The emotional consequence C is intense shame and anxiety. The work is to uncover B, the automatic belief. The client identifies the thought. He sees right through me. I am a fraud, and now everyone knows it. This is the modern equivalent of the Stoics' initial judgment. The therapist helps them catch and hold this thought. Next comes cognitive restructuring, the disputation phase. The therapist asks, what is the evidence that you are a fraud? The client might list their qualifications and past successes. What is the evidence against that thought? Perhaps the project has other strengths, or the colleague is known for harsh delivery. They examine the thought's validity. Then they apply the control filter, a core CBT skill. What about this situation can you actually control? You cannot control his opinion or his words. You can control reviewing your data for accuracy. You can control asking for specific feedback, and you can control your next steps on the project. This shifts focus from a fixed label, I am a fraud, to manageable actions. Finally, they work on a cognitive reframe. A more balanced thought might be, his criticism was harsh and hurtful, but it doesn't define my entire worth or ability. I can use this to check my work and improve my communication. The constructive action plan is nearly identical to the Stoics. Review the data, seek clarity, and proceed with the work. The structural similarity is not just striking, it is step for step. The initial catch of the automatic thought, the separation of fact from interpretation. The rigorous cross-examination of that interpretation's truth, the strategic focus on what is within one's power, the final pivot toward a constructive, value-driven action. One person calls it examining an impression to cultivate virtue. The other calls it cognitive restructuring to reduce suffering. But they are walking the same path through the same mental landscape, using the same tools to navigate an emotional obstacle. This parallel reveals the profound utility of the model. It works not because it is ancient wisdom or modern science, but because it accurately describes how our minds operate and gives us a lever to influence the process. The next logical question becomes, with such powerful tools at our disposal, why do we so often struggle to use them? Both systems share a critical, non-negotiable truth. They are not spectator sports. You cannot think your way into resilience by reading a book or listening to a lecture. Lasting change requires what the Stoics called Askēsis, a word meaning exercise or training. It is the same root as ascetic, not for deprivation but for discipline. The Stoic philosopher was not an academic. He was an athlete of the mind, and his gym was the ordinary, friction-filled reality of daily life. His training regimen consisted of specific, repeatable spiritual exercises designed to be woven into the fabric of his day. The most famous was the evening review. Seneca described it in his letters. Each night he would sit in quiet reflection and ask himself 3 questions. What wrong did I correct today? What weakness did I resist? In What Am I Better? This was not a guilt-ridden inventory, but a clear-eyed performance review of his own character. He was tracking his progress in managing his judgments and actions, celebrating small victories in self-command, and identifying where his training needed more focus the next day. Another exercise was deliberate meditation on core principles. A student might memorize key maxims from Epictetus, like "It is not things that upset us, but our judgments about them," and then actively call them to mind throughout the day when faced with irritation or desire. They would mentally rehearse their philosophy, not in a quiet study, but in the noisy marketplace when tempted by a luxury or provoked by an insult. This was cognitive rehearsal, embedding the new mental model through constant repetition. Now, step into the world of modern cognitive behavioral therapy. The principle is identical. CBT is famously a between-session therapy. The real work does not happen in the 50-minute appointment. It happens in the hours and days between, through structured homework assignments. The most common tool is the thought record. A client is given a worksheet and asked to log specific situations where they felt a strong negative emotion. They must write down the activating event, the automatic thought, the resulting feeling, and then, crucially, generate a more balanced alternative thought. This is not busy work. It is the clinical equivalent of Seneca's evening review, a structured method to build the skill of catching and restructuring judgments. Another common assignment is the behavioral experiment. If a client holds a belief like, "If I speak up in the meeting, everyone will think I am foolish," the therapist might suggest testing this prediction as a scientist would. They would plan a small, safe experiment, speak up once on a minor point, and then gather data on the actual outcome. Did people scoff, or did they simply nod and move on? This is stress inoculation in action, a real-world version of the Stoic Premeditation of Evils, where a feared possibility is confronted in a controlled way to disprove the catastrophic judgment. Activity scheduling is another key homework task, especially for low mood, where a person plans and commits to specific, valued activities to counteract inertia and build a sense of accomplishment. This directly mirrors the Stoic focus on virtuous action within one's circle of control. Both systems treat the mind as a muscle. You would not expect to develop physical strength by reading about weightlifting. You must lift the weights regularly and with correct form. Similarly, you cannot develop cognitive strength, the ability to pause, reframe, and choose a wiser response by merely understanding the theory. You must exercise it. The Stoic did his reps through nightly examination and daily meditation on principles. The CBT client does her reps through thought records and behavioral experiments. The medium differs, parchment versus a worksheet, but the mechanism is the same: deliberate, repeated practice to rewire a habitual response. This transforms philosophy and therapy from something you know into something you do. It moves insight from the head down into the nervous system, until responding with clarity instead of reactivity becomes not an effortful choice, but a new kind of instinct. The sheer volume of practice required by both systems points to a fundamental truth that changing how we think is hard, deliberate work. This raises the most practical critique of the ancient model. For all its brilliance, Stoicism was built on observation and reason, not on clinical data. Its proponents could point to lived experience and logical coherence, but they had no laboratory, no control groups, no way to measure its efficacy against other approaches for alleviating specific forms of psychological distress. It was an intuitive map of the mind, drawn with remarkable accuracy, but it remained just that, a map. For centuries, its psychological insights were philosophical propositions, not proven treatments. The modern counterpart, however, exists in a completely different evidential universe. Cognitive behavioral therapy is not merely a popular approach, it is the most extensively researched form of psychotherapy in history. Its foundation is not a single teacher's wisdom, but a mountain of empirical evidence built over decades. The validation comes from thousands of randomized controlled trials, the gold standard of medical and psychological research. In these studies, individuals experiencing challenges like persistent anxiety or low mood are randomly assigned to receive either CBT, a different form of therapy, a placebo treatment, or no treatment at all. The outcomes are meticulously measured. The consistent, overwhelming result is that CBT produces significant, lasting relief for a wide range of difficulties. It has been validated for use with adults, adolescents, and children, in individual and group formats, and even in digital applications. This is the modern laboratory that the Stoics never had. We now have scientific proof, reproducible across cultures and contexts, that systematically identifying and restructuring automatic negative thoughts leads to measurable reductions in suffering. This evidence base is what allows a therapist to say with confidence that the methods are evidence-based. It transforms the process from an art into a science-informed practice. So, does this vast modern validation invalidate the ancient philosophy? Quite the opposite. It retroactively confirms the psychological genius of the Stoics' intuitive model. Think of it this way. 2,000 years ago, a group of profound thinkers used careful observation and deep introspection to draft a blueprint of a machine they could not fully build, the resilient human mind. They correctly identified the core components, the judgment as the central processor, the focus on control as the stabilizing mechanism, and mental rehearsal as the training protocol. For millennia, that blueprint was filed away in the archives of philosophy, admired but untested on a mass scale. Then, modern clinical science arrived with the tools to finally construct the machine. Researchers like Ellis and Beck, often guided by that very blueprint, built the first prototypes. They then subjected those prototypes to the most rigorous testing imaginable. And the machines worked spectacularly well. The success of cognitive behavioral therapy does not prove that Marcus Aurelius was a therapist. It proves that he and his fellow Stoics were astonishingly accurate psychologists. Their model of the mind was not a metaphor, it was a functional schematic. The clinical trials are not a repudiation of ancient wisdom, they are its belated, peer-reviewed confirmation. The laboratory evidence tells us that the Stoics were right about the mechanism of human emotion. When we intervene at the point of judgment, as they prescribed, emotional change follows. This is a powerful reconciliation. It means we no longer have to choose between ancient wisdom and modern science. We can see them as two chapters in the same long story of understanding ourselves. The philosophy asked the right questions and sketched the answers. The science provided the rigorous methodology to verify those answers and refine them into tools for healing. This convergence gives the Stoic exercises a new kind of credibility. They are not just historical curiosities or self-help slogans. They are time-tested cognitive techniques whose core mechanism has now been validated by the most stringent standards we have. The gap between the Stoa and the lab has been bridged by data. Yet this powerful convergence is not a perfect mirror. The comparison between the ancient philosophy and the modern therapy, while profound, has its limits. The most significant difference lies in their ultimate destination. Cognitive behavioral therapy is at its core atheoretical about virtue. It makes no grand claims about what constitutes a good life. Its goal is functional, not moral. It aims to reduce distressing symptoms to help a person move from a state of suffering to a state of manageable well-being. A therapist using CBT is not there to guide you toward wisdom or justice as ultimate ends. They are there to help you stop the panic attacks, to lift the weight of persistent low mood, to break the cycle of obsessive thoughts. The measure of success is a decrease in measurable suffering and an increase in effective functioning. Stoicism, in stark contrast, was never about merely feeling better. It was about being better. Its entire architecture was designed to produce a specific kind of person, one who embodied the cardinal virtues. For the Stoic, the reduction of emotional disturbance was a welcome side effect of pursuing virtue, not the primary goal. Tranquility was the result of living in accordance with nature and reason, not an achievement in itself. This creates a subtle but crucial divergence in emphasis. The modern client might learn to challenge the thought, "I am a failure," because it causes debilitating shame. The Stoic student would challenge the same thought because it is irrational and obstructs the virtue of self-respect. The cognitive action is identical, but the underlying motivation springs from different wells, one clinical, the other ethical. This difference in purpose leads to a common, and often justified, critique of how Stoicism is sometimes practiced. Without the clinical framework and therapeutic alliance of CBT, Stoic principles can be easily misinterpreted as a mandate for emotional suppression. The popular caricature of the Stoic is a stone-faced figure, unmoved by joy or grief, repressing all feeling in the name of strength. This is a profound misunderstanding of the philosophy, but it is a persistent one. The Stoic ideal was not to feel nothing, but to not be enslaved by destructive passions. They sought to experience emotions wisely, to feel grief without being devastated by it, to feel anger without being controlled by it. However, the language of extirpating passions and maintaining apatheia can, when taken out of its philosophical context, sound like a call to numb oneself. Cognitive behavioral therapy, by its very design, avoids this pitfall. It does not ask clients to suppress emotions. It teaches them to regulate emotions. The process of identifying and restructuring thoughts is a way of understanding and modulating emotional intensity, not eliminating it. The goal is to have a more adaptive relationship with one's feelings, to experience anxiety without being paralyzed by it, or sadness without being consumed by it. This clinical focus on regulation provides a clearer, safer path for someone in genuine distress, guided by a trained professional who can monitor for harmful misinterpretations. Interestingly, the evolution of psychotherapy itself has begun to weave these threads back together. The so-called third wave of cognitive therapies, which includes approaches like acceptance and commitment therapy, or a CT, explicitly incorporates concepts that sound deeply Stoic. These therapies move beyond just changing the content of thoughts. They emphasize psychological flexibility, which involves making room for difficult thoughts and feelings without fighting them, and taking action aligned with one's deeply held values. This concept of acceptance, of willingly experiencing uncomfortable internal events in order to live a meaningful life, resonates strongly with the Stoic practice of amor fati, the loving acceptance of one's fate. A CT does not try to vigorously dispute every negative thought. Instead, it might teach a person to say, "I am having the thought that I am anxious," and then to gently carry that anxiety with them as they step into a valued action, like attending a social gathering or working on an important project. This is strikingly similar to the Stoic who acknowledges the impression of fear, examines it, and then chooses courageous action regardless. The modern therapeutic landscape is thus not a rejection of the Stoic insight, but an expansion and integration of it. It suggests that the full picture of mental well-being includes both the cognitive restructuring pioneered by Beck and Ellis, and the mindful acceptance and value-directed action that the ancients also understood. The parallel, therefore, is not a static historical curiosity. It is a living dialogue. The ancient philosophy accidentally outlined a map of the mind that modern science confirmed, and then began to color in with ever greater nuance, discovering that the territory included not only the peaks of rational challenge, but also the valleys of compassionate acceptance. This ongoing evolution invites us to see both systems not as competitors, but as complementary guides on the same essential human journey toward a life lived with less suffering and greater purpose. The living dialogue between ancient philosophy and modern therapy is not confined to academic journals. It has sparked a vibrant grassroots movement. Across the world, a growing community is actively reviving Stoicism not as a dusty historical artifact, but as a practical, daily operating system for life. This is often called modern Stoicism, and its defining feature is a conscious, deliberate fusion of the ancient exercises with the validated insights of cognitive science. Practitioners are not just reading Marcus Aurelius, they are applying his cognitive techniques with the structured intentionality of a therapeutic protocol. The bridge built by Ellis and Beck is now a busy two-way street where philosophers cite psychological studies and therapists recommend Stoic journals. This modern revival has moved beyond theory into measurable action. One of the most visible examples is an annual global event called Stoic Week. For 7 days, thousands of participants from all walks of life follow a structured online guide. Each day introduces a core Stoic principle, like the dichotomy of control or the practice of negative visualization, and provides specific exercises to try. Participants are encouraged to keep a nightly journal, much like Seneca's evening review, noting where they applied the philosophy and what they observed. But here is where the modern twist comes in. The organizers do not just rely on inspiring anecdotes. They ask participants to complete standardized psychological questionnaires at the start and end of the week, scales commonly used in clinical research to measure well-being, resilience, and negative emotions. The aggregated data gathered over many years consistently shows a statistically significant improvement in participants' reported well-being and a reduction in negative emotional states. This is a powerful convergence. It is the ancient Askēsis, the disciplined exercise, meeting the modern demand for evidence. People are not just saying they feel better, they are demonstrating it on the same scales used to validate therapeutic interventions. The week itself functions as a kind of open-source, communal cognitive behavioral training camp. When a person spends a day consciously practicing the separation of what is within their control from what is not, they are not doing philosophy, they are doing cognitive distancing. When they rehearse a potential hardship to reduce its emotional shock, they are engaging in a form of stress inoculation. Modern Stoicism, in this sense, is the democratization of that 2,000-year-old blueprint. It takes the clinically verified mechanics of cognitive change and delivers them wrapped in the rich, value-layered language of an ancient tradition. It offers more than symptom reduction. It offers a coherent philosophy of life, a narrative about resilience and purpose that many find deeply meaningful. This fusion addresses a common hunger in our modern world, for both practical tools to manage stress and a larger framework to make sense of suffering. The Stoic revival shows that the ancient model is not a relic, but a remarkably adaptable toolkit. It works in the therapist's office as a targeted treatment, and it works in the living room as a daily practice for anyone seeking to build a more resilient, intentional life. The data from initiatives like Stoic Week suggests that when people engage with these ideas actively and systematically, the benefits are real and measurable. This brings us to a final, personal threshold. With this powerful, validated toolkit now laid out before us, a simple but daunting question remains. How do we actually begin to use it in our own lives, not as a theoretical concept, but as a lived reality? This is where the story transcends the therapy room. The shared core of Stoicism and cognitive behavioral therapy offers something far broader than a clinical treatment plan. It provides a universal framework for building psychological resilience, a kind of mental operating system for navigating the inevitable challenges of being human. Its applications stretch far beyond treating anxiety or low mood, reaching into the very fabric of how we handle everyday stress, pursue excellence, and face an uncertain future. Consider the common, grinding stress of modern life, the endless notifications, the traffic jam that makes you late, the demanding project with a shifting deadline. Our instinct is often to treat the stress as a direct result of the external chaos, but the framework invites a different response. It asks you to insert that critical pause. In the moment your phone pings for the 10th time, instead of a reactive surge of frustration, you can practice that gatekeeper awareness. What is the story I am telling myself right now? Is it, "This is completely unmanageable," or "Everyone needs me right now and I am failing"? Simply noticing that automatic narrative creates a sliver of space. Then apply the filter of control. Can I control the influx of messages? Perhaps not entirely, but can I control turning on a do not disturb function for the next hour to focus? Can I control sending a brief, polite response that I will reply in detail later? This shifts the experience from one of helpless overwhelm to one of strategic management. The external pressure may not vanish, but your relationship to it transforms. You move from being flooded by the wave to learning how to swim in it. This same framework is the hidden engine of elite performance, whether on the athletic field or in the boardroom. Performance psychology is built on managing the mind under extreme pressure. A gymnast poised on the balance beam is not just fighting gravity, she is managing a torrent of internal judgments. One wobble can trigger a cascade of thoughts. I am losing it. This routine is ruined. Coaches now routinely teach cognitive techniques that are direct descendants of this ancient model. They train athletes in thought stopping, catching that negative cascade the moment it begins. They practice reframing, where a wobble is not a catastrophe but a test of recovery focus. They emphasize controllables. Keep your eyes on your own landing spot. Control your next breath. Control the precision of your next move. The athlete learns, just as the Stoic philosopher did, that their performance is not dictated by the single mistake, but by their judgment of that mistake and their subsequent focused action. In business, a leader facing a market downturn or a failed product launch can be paralyzed by thoughts of personal failure and ruin. The resilient leader, consciously or not, employs the same cognitive architecture. They separate the factual reality of the setback from the catastrophic story. They focus their team's energy not on lamenting the uncontrollable market forces, but on the controllable next steps: innovation, customer outreach, and agile adaptation. This is not positive thinking, it is strategic thinking, powered by a disciplined management of internal narrative. Ultimately, the greatest test of this framework is not in managing daily stress or peak performance, but in navigating profound uncertainty. Life, by its nature, is uncertain. Health, relationships, careers, the global landscape, none come with guarantees. The ancient response to this was the premeditation of evils, not to dwell in fear, but to inoculate the mind against the tyranny of the unexpected. The modern application is building what psychologists call tolerance for uncertainty. This is the ability to move forward, to make decisions, and to find meaning even when outcomes are not assured. The framework builds this tolerance by repeatedly guiding you back to the same central question: what is within my sphere of influence right now? In the face of a worrying health diagnosis, one cannot control the ultimate outcome. But one can control seeking the best information, following a treatment plan, cultivating a supportive environment, and choosing where to place one's attention moment to moment. This focused action in the face of the unknown is the very essence of courage, a virtue the Stoics prized and a psychological state that modern resilience research validates. The framework does not promise safety or predict success. It offers something more durable, a method for maintaining your agency and your values even when the path ahead is shrouded in fog. It teaches you to build your stability not on the shifting ground of external circumstances, but on the solid rock of your own reasoned choices and actions. This turns resilience from a trait you hope you have into a skill you can actively practice, one deliberate judgment at a time. This remarkable convergence was not a coincidence of history. It was a convergent discovery. Two groups of brilliant observers, separated by 2,000 years and entirely different cultural frameworks, were independently studying the same complex system, the human mind in distress. They were each, in their own way, attempting to reverse engineer its core malfunction. The Stoics began with a philosophical question: how can a person live a good and virtuous life? Their method was introspection and logical deduction, observing the inner turbulence that prevented tranquility. The cognitive therapists began with a clinical question: how can we alleviate the measurable suffering of anxiety and depression? Their method was empirical observation and scientific testing, mapping the thought patterns that fueled distress. Yet they arrived at nearly identical operating instructions because they were looking at the same fundamental machinery. They both recognized that raw events do not directly cause our emotional weather. They saw that a critical, internal process of interpretation sits in between, a process that can be observed, interrupted, and retrained. This suggests something profound about the architecture of human consciousness itself. It implies that the link between perception and emotion is not a fixed, hardwired circuit, but a malleable pathway shaped by our judgments. The Stoics called this pathway the province of reason and belief. Cognitive science calls it information processing and schema. The labels differ, but the territory is the same. Both discovered that suffering often arises when this interpretive process becomes rigid, habitual, and skewed toward threat or loss. A person stuck in a cycle of low mood might interpret a quiet afternoon as evidence of their loneliness and worthlessness. A Stoic struggling with despair might interpret a personal setback as proof of a hostile universe. The cognitive content varies, but the structural error is identical. The mind is treating its own automatic narrative as objective fact. This is why their solutions align so precisely. To fix a system, you must first understand its points of failure. Both traditions identified the same critical failure point: the uncritical acceptance of our immediate, evaluative thoughts. Their repair manual, therefore, had to include the same first step: developing the metacognitive skill to notice those thoughts as objects of awareness. From there, the logical next steps flowed naturally. If you can see the thought, you can question its truth. If you can question its truth, you can choose not to be governed by it. And if you are not governed by it, you can direct your energy toward what is genuinely within your influence. This is not a philosophical preference or a therapeutic fad. It appears to be a functional description of how a healthy, adaptive human mind can regulate its own distress. They were not inventing a technique, they were discovering a latent capacity. The Stoics framed this capacity as the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. The cognitive therapists framed it as the acquisition of psychological skills. One was a moral project, the other a clinical one. But at the level of mental process, they converged on the same set of practices because those practices tap into a fundamental mechanism of human psychological flexibility. The accident was not that they found the same answer. The accident was that a road built for spiritual development turned out to be the most direct route to clinical relief. This convergent discovery gives their shared model a unique authority. It has been validated by both lived experience across centuries and by controlled experiment across decades. It stands at the rare intersection of profound wisdom and reproducible science. This history matters deeply for anyone stepping into a therapist's office today. For a person beginning cognitive behavioral therapy, the process can feel strange at first. You are asked to track your thoughts on paper, to question beliefs that feel undeniably true, to focus on actions that seem small. It is easy to wonder, where did these techniques even come from? Are they just a modern invention, a set of arbitrary exercises? Understanding the 2,000-year-old thread connecting your therapist's questions to a Roman emperor's journal changes that experience. It demystifies the work. Suddenly, you are not just filling out a worksheet. You are practicing a refined version of a cognitive discipline that has helped humans navigate hardship for millennia. The core skill you are learning, the ability to pause and examine your own thinking, is not a clinical trick. It is a philosophical skill set, one of the most powerful ever developed for managing the human mind. This perspective can be profoundly empowering. It frames therapy not as a process of fixing something broken inside you, but as an education in a timeless form of mental literacy. You are not a patient receiving a treatment so much as a student acquiring tools, the same way you might learn a new language or a musical instrument. The language is the language of your own cognition. The instrument is your attention. When a therapist guides you to separate a fact from your fearful interpretation of it, you are not just managing anxiety. You are walking through the same mental doorway that Seneca used to maintain his composure in a corrupt court, or that Epictetus used to find freedom while in chains. This connection adds a layer of dignity and agency to the therapeutic work. It suggests you are engaging with something fundamental about the human condition, not merely applying a temporary bandage. For someone considering therapy but hesitant, this lineage can also reduce stigma. Seeking help can then be seen not as a sign of weakness, but as a practical decision to train your mind with the most effective tools available, tools whose value is supported by both ancient wisdom and modern laboratories. It transforms therapy from a clinical intervention into a continuation of a very old, very human conversation about how to live well. Knowing that the techniques have roots in a comprehensive philosophy of life can make them feel more substantial, more trustworthy. You are not just learning to feel better in the moment. You are building a cognitive framework for resilience that can serve you for a lifetime, because its foundations were stress-tested by generations of thinkers facing every conceivable challenge. This understanding turns the therapy room into a modern stoa, a place where you learn to become the calm, reasoned author of your own inner narrative, no matter what storms the world may bring. For students of philosophy, this convergence is not a footnote, it is a revelation. It transforms Stoicism from a historical subject confined to textbooks into a living, breathing case study in the practical power of philosophical inquiry. Often, the study of philosophy can feel abstract, a debate about ideas detached from the messiness of daily life. The journey from the stoa to the therapy room proves otherwise. It demonstrates with stunning clarity that rigorous thought about the human condition can yield insights so precise, so functionally accurate, that they wait centuries for science to catch up and confirm them. This is philosophy not as a speculative game, but as a form of pre-scientific discovery. The Stoics were not just thinkers, they were early researchers of the mind, using the tools they had, introspection and logic, to map a territory that psychology would later survey with clinical instruments. Their work shows that asking the deepest questions about how to live can accidentally blueprint a future science of well-being. This elevates the entire discipline. It argues that philosophy at its best is not merely about interpreting texts, but about decoding the operating system of human experience. When a student reads Epictetus now, they are not just analyzing an ancient argument. They are examining a 2,000-year-old hypothesis that has since passed the most rigorous modern tests. This changes the stakes. It means the Stoic texts are more than historical artifacts. They are proto-scientific documents, their value verified by data. This perspective can breathe new life into philosophical study. It moves the conversation from what did they believe to how were they right, and what can we still learn from their model of the mind. For a student wrestling with existential questions or the stress of academic life, this connection offers a powerful bridge. The principles discussed in a seminar on Hellenistic philosophy are the same cognitive tools a counselor might recommend for managing performance anxiety or perfectionism. The dichotomy of control is not just a Stoic thesis. It is a practical strategy for navigating the pressures of exams, deadlines, and uncertain futures. This understanding turns philosophy from a subject you study into a toolkit you can use, validating its enduring relevance in the most concrete terms possible. It proves that the ultimate aim of wisdom, pursued with enough clarity and rigor, will inevitably intersect with the universal human need for peace and resilience. The story of this accidental blueprint is therefore a profound defense of the philosophical project itself. It shows that when we think deeply enough about what it means to be human, we don't just arrive at interesting opinions, we can uncover fundamental truths about our own psychology, truths that stand ready to help us whenever we are finally ready to apply them. But this very power carries a subtle, modern risk. The immense popularity of these ideas has created a crowded marketplace of advice, where the profound can be easily confused with the merely pleasing. A single quote from Marcus Aurelius can appear on a sunset background next to a generic motivational slogan. A complex cognitive technique can be distilled into a 3-step life hack promising instant calm. This is the danger of misappropriation, where a deep practice of the mind is flattened into a commodity of self-help. The distinction is not trivial. It is the difference between building a seawall and painting a shoreline. One prepares you for the storm, the other simply makes the view more attractive before it hits. Superficial Stoicism can become a performance of indifference, a posture of unfeeling strength used to mask vulnerability rather than to engage with it wisely. It mistakes the suppression of emotion for the mastery of emotion. Similarly, reducing cognitive behavioral therapy to simple positive thinking misses its entire point. CBT is not about replacing every negative thought with a forced, cheerful affirmation. That approach often creates a brittle inner dialogue, where a whispered fear is met with a shouted platitude, and the underlying distortion remains unchallenged. The real work is not affirmation, but investigation. It is the often uncomfortable, forensic examination of why you believe what you believe in the first place. The power of both systems lies not in their quotable insights, but in the rigorous daily practice of applying them. It is in the friction. It is in the moment you feel the heat of anger, and instead of lashing out, you create that internal pause to ask, what judgment am I adding to this situation? It is in the exhaustion of low mood when you nevertheless complete a thought record, not because you feel like it, but because you are committed to the discipline of understanding your mind. This work is fundamentally unglamorous. There is nothing instantly shareable about sitting with a journal, dissecting a moment of perceived failure, or rehearsing a feared scenario to drain its power. These are private, repetitive exercises. They are the cognitive equivalent of practicing scales on a piano, not performing a concerto. The Instagram post shows the serene quote. The real practice happens in the messy, unseen effort of confronting a cognitive distortion, the habitual story your mind tells that amplifies your suffering. That confrontation is rarely easy. It asks you to question narratives you have carried for years, to sit with uncertainty, and to take responsibility for your interpretations. A catchy mantra might offer temporary relief, like a breeze through an open window. The disciplined practice of cognitive restructuring, however, rewires the architecture of the room itself. It changes how you process the wind, so you are no longer at the mercy of every draft. The warning, then, is to be wary of any presentation of these ideas that promises ease, speed, or a permanent shield from pain. The Stoic path and the therapeutic journey are not escapes from difficulty. They are navigational systems for moving through it with clarity and purpose. Their value is earned through consistent, honest application, in the quiet spaces between the inspiring quotes and the breakthrough moments. This is where the ancient blueprint and the modern protocol prove their worth, not when life is easy, but precisely when it is not. The frontier of this integration is already being explored in quiet offices and research studies. While the core cognitive model of CBT is firmly established, a growing movement within psychology is asking a deeper question. What if reducing symptoms is not the final destination, but a way station on the road to a more meaningful life? This is where contemporary therapists are looking beyond the mechanics of thought, restructuring, and reaching for the richer, more value-laden concepts of Stoicism to fill a perceived gap. They are integrating ideas that the original cognitive behavioral pioneers set aside, not because they were wrong, but because they were outside the scope of a purely clinical treatment. The most profound of these integrations revolves around the Stoic concept of virtue. Modern therapy, in its standard form, is often ethically neutral. It helps you manage anger, but does not necessarily guide you on when anger is justified. It helps reduce social anxiety, but does not define what constitutes a good relationship. Stoicism's unwavering focus on wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance provides a compass. Some therapists, especially in approaches like acceptance and commitment therapy, now explicitly work with clients to clarify their personal values. This is a secular, psychological cousin to the Stoic virtues. A therapist might ask, what kind of person do you want to be in this difficult situation? What action would feel courageous or just to you, even if it is difficult? This shifts the focus from merely feeling less bad to acting more in alignment with a chosen ethical framework. The therapeutic work becomes not just about silencing a critical inner voice, but about listening for the voice of the person you aspire to become. Another Stoic exercise finding modern resonance is the view from above. This was a meditation where an individual would mentally zoom out from their immediate troubles, picturing their city from a hill, their country from the sky, and finally the earth as a tiny blue dot in the vast cosmos. The goal was to gain perspective, to see one's problems as small and transient within the grand sweep of time and space. In a therapy context, this is not about minimizing pain, but about contextualizing it. A therapist might guide a client feeling trapped by a life crisis to gently broaden their view. They might ask, how will this look in 5 years? What is the larger story of your life that this chapter fits into? This cognitive shift can reduce the feeling of being engulfed by a problem, creating psychological space to breathe and strategize. It is a deliberate antidote to catastrophic thinking, replacing a mental close-up of disaster with a wider, more balanced landscape. Perhaps the most striking integration involves the Stoic practice of memento mori, the remembrance of mortality. For the ancients, this was not a morbid fixation, but a vivid tool for prioritizing virtue and action. The constant awareness that life is finite was meant to shock one out of complacency, to clarify what truly matters. In modern therapeutic settings, particularly in meaning-centered therapies used in palliative care or with people facing major life transitions, this concept is approached with great sensitivity. The therapeutic reframe is not about death itself, but about life. A counselor might gently explore, if your time were limited, what would you want to make sure you had done? What relationships would you want to mend? What contributions would feel meaningful? This line of questioning uses the concept of finitude not to induce fear, but to illuminate values and ignite purpose. It helps individuals cut through the noise of daily trivialities and connect with what provides a deep sense of significance. This is resilience building of the highest order. It fortifies the spirit not just to bounce back from hardship, but to move forward toward something that feels worth the struggle. These integrations represent a fascinating evolution. They suggest that the ancient blueprint may have contained rooms that modern science initially bypassed in its urgent mission to stop the fire. Now, with the fire contained, therapists are returning to those rooms, finding within them not clinical techniques but sources of light. They are discovering that alongside the skill of managing our judgments, we may also need a star to navigate by. The Stoics called that star virtue and a life in accordance with nature. Modern therapy, in its most holistic forms, is beginning to call it valued living and psychological richness. This convergence hints at a more complete model of well-being, one that addresses not only how we think, but ultimately what we live for. The private journal of a Roman emperor and a therapist's worksheet are bound by the same human need. Open the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, and you are not reading statecraft. You are witnessing a mind in training. The ink on those ancient pages captures a nightly ritual, a man holding his own thoughts up to the light of reason. He questions his anger, examines his fears, and coaches himself toward patience. 2,000 years later, a person sits with a thought record from their therapist. The columns are labeled situation, automatic thought, emotion, alternative response. They are doing, in a structured clinical format, the exact same cognitive work. Both tools are designed to interrupt the silent, persuasive monologue we all have running in our heads. That inner discourse, if left unchallenged, can dictate our entire emotional world. The emperor and the modern client are both learning to become the author of that story rather than its captive audience. This is the living tradition, not of a religion, but of a psychological practice. It is a method for mental clarity that has been passed down not through sacred texts, but through the practical need to navigate a difficult world. The format evolves from parchment to paper to a digital note on a phone. The core action remains stubbornly unchanged. It is the act of externalizing your internal chatter, of taking the swirling, convincing narrative in your mind and laying it out where you can see it. Once a thought is outside of you, written down, it loses some of its hypnotic power. You can look at it. You can ask, is this really true? Marcus Aurelius wrote to remind himself that the noise of the court, the flattery, and the criticism were externals not worth his inner peace. He was, in essence, completing a thought record about power and reputation. A person today fills out a worksheet to see that the thought, "My friend didn't text back because they are angry with me," is just one interpretation among many, and likely not the most accurate. The gap between the two is bridged by a simple, profound realization. Our suffering is often a language problem. We are speaking to ourselves in a dialect of fear, or lack, or judgment, and we have forgotten we can learn another tongue. The journal and the worksheet are translation guides. They help us decode our own distress. They provide a structured space to move from the language of reaction, "This is unbearable," to the language of response. What part of this can I actually bear, and what can I do about it? This lineage matters because it removes the isolation from our struggles. When you sit with your own difficult thoughts, you are participating in a very old, very human conversation. You are using a tool that has been refined across centuries, from the philosophical exercises of the Stoa to the evidence-based protocols of the lab. The medium has been optimized, but the mission is eternal, to master the inner discourse so that we can meet the outer world not with fragility, but with a grounded and resilient presence. That emperor's journal and the client's worksheet share a startlingly similar architecture. But this remarkable convergence between Stoicism and cognitive behavioral therapy opens a door to a much larger, more intriguing possibility. If one ancient philosophy, developed through introspection and reason, could so accurately prefigure a cornerstone of modern psychology, what other traditions might hold similar blueprints? Our search for the mechanics of the mind may not be confined to the history of the West. Across the globe and throughout time, human cultures have developed sophisticated systems for understanding and training consciousness, often embedded within spiritual or philosophical frameworks. The Stoic case suggests these are not merely cultural artifacts, but could be untapped repositories of psychological insight, waiting for the clarifying lens of modern science. Consider, for example, the intricate contemplative psychology found within Buddhism. For over 2,500 years, Buddhist traditions have developed detailed, systematic practices for observing the mind. Their foundational teachings on the nature of suffering and its cessation map a terrain that modern psychology is only now beginning to chart with clinical precision. A core Buddhist practice is mindfulness, the non-judgmental awareness of present-moment experience. For centuries, monks and practitioners have trained in this skill to cultivate peace and insight. In the late 20th century, a clinician named John Kabat-Zinn extracted this practice from its religious context, creating a secular program called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, or MBSR. He was not teaching Buddhism, he was testing a cognitive and attentional exercise. The results were profound. Rigorous studies now show that MBSR and its therapeutic descendants, like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, are highly effective at preventing relapse into low mood and reducing the impact of chronic stress and pain. The ancient technique of mindfulness, when studied in a laboratory, proved to be a powerful modulator of attention and emotional regulation. This is not a vague parallel, it is another clear case of validation. A contemplative technology, refined over millennia, was found to have specific, measurable effects on the brain and behavior. The Buddhist analysis of how clinging to thoughts and sensations creates suffering bears a fascinating resemblance to the cognitive model, just viewed through a different lens. Where CBT teaches us to dispute irrational thoughts, mindfulness teaches us to observe all thoughts with detachment, to see them as passing mental events rather than absolute truths. Both strategies, in the end, aim to break our fusion with our internal narrative. This pattern invites us to look elsewhere. What about the Aristotelian concept of the golden mean, the idea that virtue lies between extremes of excess and deficiency? Could this be an ancient framework for understanding emotional and behavioral balance, a precursor to modern concepts of emotional regulation? The Taoist emphasis on wu-wei, or effortless action, aligning with the natural flow of events, might offer profound insights into the psychology of flow states and the reduction of performance anxiety. Even the Socratic method itself, a relentless dialogue aimed at uncovering contradictions in one's beliefs, is a powerful template for cognitive restructuring, a way of verbally unpacking our assumptions. The question is not whether these traditions are scientifically true in a doctrinal sense, but whether they contain practical, psychological wisdom that can be isolated, tested, and integrated. The story of Stoicism and CBT provides a compelling template for this integration. It shows that a tradition can be approached not as a set of dogmas to be believed, but as a centuries-long experiment in human psychology. The founders of these systems were, in a sense, master observers of the mind. They conducted their research not in labs, but in the field of lived experience, developing hypotheses and techniques through trial and error across generations. Our modern scientific method gives us the tools to take their most potent techniques and ask, how does this work? What are the active ingredients? Who does it help? And under what conditions? This is a collaborative project between the humanities and the sciences, where ancient maps are used to guide modern expeditions into the territory of well-being. It respects the depth of these traditions while seeking their universal, applicable kernels. This perspective transforms our relationship with the past. We are no longer merely studying history. We are auditing a long-term research and development project on the human condition. The unanswered question hanging in the air is not if there are more of these bridges to be found, but how many, and what they might teach us about building a more resilient, aware, and compassionate future. The entire journey rests on a single transformative mechanism. An event occurs in the world around you. In the flash of a synapse, your mind applies an interpretation, a judgment, a story about what that event means. And from that story, not from the event itself, your emotions and behaviors inevitably flow. This three-step sequence is the hidden engine of our experience. The event is neutral, the emotional consequence is real, but the power resides entirely in the middle step, the silent, instantaneous act of interpretation. This is the revolutionary discovery made in the Stoa and confirmed in the laboratory. Our freedom and our health are not found in controlling the uncontrollable events of step 1, nor in merely managing the symptoms of step 3. They are found in the courageous, deliberate work of intervening at step 2, to catch the judgment as it forms, to hold it to the light, and to ask, is this story true? Is it helpful? Is it the only one possible? That pause, that question, is the fulcrum on which a life of reactivity can pivot toward a life of response. It is the point where philosophy becomes practice and where therapy builds resilience. Everything we have explored, the emperor's journal, the therapist's worksheet, the practices of attention and reframing, are all sophisticated tools designed for one fundamental purpose: to master that critical, fleeting moment of interpretation. When you change the story you tell yourself about what is happening, you do not change the past. You change your entire future in that moment. You reclaim authorship of your inner world. This is not a metaphor. It is a cognitive fact, as applicable to a moment of road rage as it is to a lifetime of grief. The quality of our lives is built, thought by thought, in that quiet space between what happens and how we feel. To build wisely, there is the ultimate act of self-command. That emperor's journal and the client's worksheet are, in the end, proof of the same profound human truth. This historical convergence is not a mere intellectual curiosity. It is a testament to the enduring power of a single, brilliant model of the mind. Stoicism did far more than offer wise sayings for difficult times. Through its relentless focus on mastering our judgments, it accidentally engineered the very cognitive architecture that would become the foundation of our most effective modern psychotherapy. The philosophers were not trying to cure anxiety, they were trying to build character. Yet in mapping the path to virtue, they inevitably charted the pathways of thought that lead to suffering and, more importantly, to liberation. Their system was a pre-scientific discovery of how our inner world operates, a blueprint so accurate it waited 2 millennia for science to provide the clinical tools to build upon it. This story is about more than history or therapy. It is about the enduring human quest to understand and heal ourselves. For centuries, that quest lived in the realm of philosophy and spirituality. Today, it continues in the laboratory and the therapist's office. The tools have evolved, the language has changed, but the fundamental insight remains. We are not prisoners of our circumstances. We are the interpreters of our experience, and in that act of interpretation lies our greatest power. Whether you are drawn to the rich, value-driven framework of the ancient Stoics or the clear, evidence-based steps of cognitive behavioral therapy, you are engaging with 2 branches of the same deep-rooted tree. Each offers a way to cultivate that critical pause, to question the stories you tell yourself, and to build a life of greater resilience and purpose. So the next time you read a line from Marcus Aurelius or hear about a technique from cognitive behavioral therapy, remember you are not just encountering an idea. You are touching a 2,000-year-old thread in the ongoing human project of learning to live, not just with less suffering, but with more meaning.